I've discovered through puzzle design that I'm willing to engage with beautiful messes in order to smooth out the messiness and make things more beautiful. A lot of my conversations out in the world are conversations surrounding, well, we've tried that and the mess was not beautiful. That's the expectation of work, is that there are just things that just can't be solved. And so you have to compromise in some fashion. That's just the nature of work, as opposed to, well, let's actually just sit down, have a conversation, and let's figure this out. Let's put all the pieces on the table. Let's sort things out, and then let's come together and create something beautiful.
Welcome to the Work for Humans podcast. This is Dart Lindsley. You've probably heard me ask many guests on the show what they hire their job to do for them. I've asked that question of over 1,000 people. And one of the most frequent answers I get is, I hire my job to give me interesting puzzles to solve. So, as a designer, I wanted to find somebody who could tell us something about the design of great puzzles so that we can identify design attributes that we could potentially design into work. I didn't know who that person might be until I found Jasen Robillard. Jasen is the founder, CEO, and lead puzzle designer at StumpCraft, which is a premium wooden jigsaw puzzle company based in Canada. These are not normal jigsaw puzzles. They are super challenging. A 500-piece puzzle took me more than a week that included 2 dinner parties with puzzle-solving friends. While I was solving it, I dreamed about puzzles. And it got so bad that at one point I noticed my brain was trying to figure out how a barista's tattoos might fit together better. This puzzle was super compelling, but the question is why? And what can we learn from their design? In this episode, Jasen and I talk about the journey that led him to launch StumpCraft, the definition and attributes of a great puzzle, and the difference between puzzles, problems, and messes at work. We also discuss the components of a compelling puzzle, work as an empathy playground, puzzles as part of the transformation economy, and other topics. So, if you enjoyed today's episode, make sure to hit that subscribe button so you never miss out on future episodes. And now I present my conversation with Jasen Robillard. Jasen Robillard, welcome to Work for Humans.
Thanks for having me.
So, in my research in what people want from work, a very large proportion, I've never tried to quantify what the proportion is, but a very large proportion of respondents say that they hire their job to give them puzzles to solve. And they say it in a lot of different ways, but it often boils down to that. And so there's this design practice, which you may know of, which is design by analogy, which is let's look at other examples of puzzles that people like, or whatever it is that something people like, or solves the same problem for people. Let's look at those things. Let's figure out what the design attributes are. And let's see if we can transfer the design attributes from that other problem solver to this one. And so I have for a really long time wanted to have somebody on the show who could talk about the design of puzzles. But I didn't have any idea where to find that person or who that person might be until I found you, which was by accident. A lot of times I track people down, but ran into you by accident. And you are a puzzle designer, a puzzle manufacturer, and I want to dig into what makes a great puzzle. So before we get there, how did you come to running StumpCraft? How did you come to puzzles? And how did you know that that's what you wanted to do and start doing it?
Maybe I'll answer that last part first. And I'll say that I probably didn't know fully that this was what I needed to do before I did it. So it was a bit of self-discovery through necessity. So my professional career, I've been an engineer, I've been a product specialist, I've been a domain expert for mapping, geological mapping. So that's my background. I've got a background in environmental and geological engineering. I did a master's in stochastic analysis of geophysical modeling, tried to implement fractal stochastics to reverse engineer geophysical models, mostly for oil and gas, agricultural applications. And when those pursuits came to a sharp decline, I had to figure out what the next elegant step would be. I'm a big board game player. Through that hobby, I discovered these wooden puzzles that I'm now making. Was really a big fan of those, not necessarily a big fan of traditional puzzles, but really enjoyed the aesthetic and really the embodied nature of these thicker wood puzzles. And when my hours declined from 80 hours to 60 to 50 to 40, all the way down to 5, necessity is the mother of invention. And I just looked at what I enjoyed in my life, games, puzzles, and I guess I just naturally drifted into this creative aspect of creating puzzles in order to solve them.
And did you start with jigsaw puzzles or did you start with some other kind of puzzle?
I immediately went to jigsaw puzzles. I can't necessarily explain why. I'd been buying puzzles from a now, I guess I'd call them a competitor. At the time, I was a big fan of theirs, Liberty Puzzles in Colorado. I'm still a big fan of their work, but that's what really got me into this particular genre of puzzles. Observed that they were manufacturing in the US, catering mainly to a US audience. And I figured that that Canadian audience wasn't being captured by the current market. Canadian art wasn't being well represented, and there's great Canadian art. I was hearkening back to the age of the Group of Seven, and where's the current Group of Seven now? And I just wanted to provide a vehicle mainly for exposing Canadian art to Canadians, but also to the rest of the world. And the puzzle medium seemed like an apt marketplace to explore.
Who are the Group of Seven?
Group of Seven are a famous group of artists out of Canada that really explored the Canadian landscape and exposed Canadians to the beauty and the world, I should say. They exposed the world to the natural Canadian landscape. They each had their own style. There are many artists that are affiliated with Group of Seven, and they're quite well known in Ontario, where I'm from, but somewhat unknown outside of that Toronto, Ontario bubble. And that's indicative of, I think, of Canadian art in general.
It's interesting, the idea of puzzle as an engagement medium for other arts. It reminds me a little bit of how classical music, classical composers in particular, have found enormous careers in the gaming industry. If you really want to hear a lot of classical music or a lot of composed music, it's in gaming. And so it makes sense to me, this idea of using puzzles as a platform for artistic communication.
It provides a nice backdrop for something to emerge.
What is a puzzle?
I'll go back to the way puzzles came to be. They came to be through essentially map making, right? So they were largely used as an educational tool to teach people about maps. And so my perspective on puzzles is that they are self-assembled maps. They allow the interlocutor to build a map of the future possible through self-assembly rules that are embedded within the puzzle. That's how I frame it. I really like Rilke's description of what art is in Letters to a Young Poet. So I do a tweak on that, and I say that puzzles offer an atlas of possibility for the land of being mapped through the land of art.
Interesting how often maps have come up in this conversation. You came out of cartography and geology and arrived at that phrase. What makes a puzzle compelling? I think that's a central idea here, is that there are puzzles that are meh. Like algebra is a puzzle. Some people love it, but you don't find it in the New York Times. In the New York Times, you have crosswords, you have Sudoku, you have a whole bunch of different puzzles, but you don't have algebra. So there's something about algebra that doesn't do it for us, and I don't know what it is. But there's something about these other puzzles, including jigsaw puzzles, that is compelling. And so what are the components of a compelling puzzle?
I think our maps of what make things compelling are very much in attunement with one another. So I would describe a good puzzle as it has to be somewhat predictable. It has to be pleasant to do. And typically that will have to do with the aesthetics of the puzzle. that align with your own aesthetics. And it has to be positively balanced unpredictability. So it's both predictable and unpredictable. So there's an aspect of novelty that you come to expect, but it's not overwhelming. It's finding that Goldilocks zone of the right amount of frustration that leads you to a cathartic moment of aha or wow, that was amazing, or I've discovered something about myself or about the world. So those are the key elements that I like to embed within my puzzles.
There's a lot in that, I think, what you just said. One of them is difficult but not impossible. It has to be right on that boundary between what's too easy, don't want to do it. Too hard, I don't want to do it. And so calibrating the difficulty to the abilities of the person is an important design attribute. It needs to exceed their baseline capability by just a little bit. So there's different kinds of beauty in puzzles. So first of all, let me say something about the difficulty of the puzzles that you make. The difficulty of the puzzles that you make is different from the difficulty of standard puzzles. You sent me a couple of puzzles. And by the way, there's a couple of times during this conversation where this is going to sound like a commercial for your puzzles. And I just want to tell listeners that's not the objective here, is not to make a commercial for StumpCraft puzzles. But when we're talking about great design attributes, and I'm pointing at those puzzles, it's going to sound that way, right? So a standard puzzle has very predictably shaped pieces. In fact, I suspect that the standard off-the-shelf puzzle, they're using exactly the same die to cut puzzle after puzzle, and all the pieces are the same, and they're just putting a different picture on there. And the shape of your puzzle pieces is exotic. I don't even have a word for what these shapes are. Doodles might be the closest thing I can come to them.
That's correct. Yeah. I'm essentially doodling to get these shapes. And the attempt is to make the doodle as beautiful as possible. Now, they're not always going to be equivalently beautiful, but in their uniqueness, there's a beauty in that.
So I'm not going to be able to describe with words for listeners what they look like. Maybe you can try to, but I'm going to say doodles. I'm going to say organic. I'm going to say quirky. Every piece is unexpected. Then there's these hidden puzzle pieces that actually are shapes that you recognize, like a lion or a beaver.
But wouldn't fit in a traditional puzzle. So in that way, they don't belong, or there's a sense where they don't belong, but they do.
And so on the micro scale of this puzzle, I'm having these micro experiences of surprise and witticism. A lot of times the word I came back to was witticism. You must have constraints in how a puzzle piece can actually be made. Like at the end of the day, I need to be able to pick this thing up. I mean, not that I'm going to try to do that, but I'm going to pick it up. It's going to hang together. So there must be some constraints that you're working on in terms of shape.
Yes, and that has evolved. I'm 7 years into this design process, and I'm finding that my, whatever you want to call it, skill or my own appreciation for aesthetics that appeal to me or might appeal to others, I'm keeping that in mind. And so that list of constraints or affordances is constantly evolving. And I'm also poking holes at them as well as I go. So if there's a constraint that I've used in the past, I might flip that on its head in a future puzzle, just so that I'm testing to see whether those constraints are real or not, or useful. But right now, I would say the constraints are, there's a physical constraint in that I want the puzzles to last. These are intended to be heirloom. I want these puzzles to be done over and over and over again. The intent is for them to be gifts to be passed on among friends or family, intergenerationally, over across time. And so by default, I want these to last. And so the thickness of what I would call the throat of a lock, there's a minimum thickness there that I try to maintain. And that's about 2 millimeters from my perspective. It can go thicker than that, but that's the minimum constraint. Over time, I've found that a fairly even distribution of piece size feels aesthetically pleasing. And so if there's a wide variety, so from a big piece that's, say, 2 to 3 inches long versus my standard piece, which is about 1 inch, that is too much variability in terms of piece size. And so I try to make sure that all the pieces are within a certain range of surface area so that when you're looking at the sea of pieces on the table, that they all seem to belong to the same project. Those are two constraints that I play with. The placement of the pieces is another aspect that I personally play with. So I'll try to put some of the thematic shapes that relate to the art in locations that either confer what the object is or belong in the context. So if it's a bird, I'll put it in a tree, or I might make the breast of the robin red and try to find an area where there's red for the breast, yellow for the beak, and black for the wings.
Got it. Got it. I didn't pick that up. I did notice that many of the tree shapes were green. I did notice that.
Maybe another aspect is I am trying to not be standard. There's a preponderance of these standard puzzles with a fairly grid-like structure. You know, if you look at traditional puzzles, they will have very obvious perimeter edges, very obvious corners, and I'm deliberately breaking away from that norm. I will split corners. I will make the edges completely non-obvious. I will put edges on the inside to throw you off so that you must adapt and go beyond. You must transcend the rules that you've learned in the past in order to solve this puzzle in a pleasant way. I'm deliberately trying to break frame.
Yeah, I'll give a good example of that. There was a curved line that was starting to assemble inside the puzzle. And I said, oh, this is going to be a circle. And so I set out to complete the circle. It was not a circle. It was two hemispheres tucked into each other. They didn't make a circle at all. It was like a plot twist. And in fact, okay, so there's puzzle as object. And we're talking a little bit about that right now, which is that puzzle as a beautifully designed object that has a certain feel to it. It's going to be really hard to translate this feel thing to work, like the feel of a piece. I get what you mean about thicker pieces. This is going to sound odd. I fish, and I like metal lures for fishing, and I don't like flies. And why? Flies are fuzzy. Metal lures are nice little metal things. I just like them better. Now, the pieces of your puzzles in your hand, first of all, they are thick, but they're a lot more like metal lures than they are like fuzzy flies. Aesthetically speaking, though, tactily, they are three-dimensional. In fact, important point. Although they end up, at the end of the day, being a two-dimensional picture, each one of them individually is three-dimensional and hard and has a three-dimensional presentation. So you said that puzzles are hard, but not too hard, that they are beautiful. And I want to talk about where the beauty resides. The beauty in your puzzles is in the eye, because you can look at the picture of the puzzle and it's a beautiful picture. It's in the shape. Some puzzles have beauty in their physics or in their math. And I've never felt that jigsaw puzzles have beauty in their math. Like a chess puzzle has beauty in the math itself. And really great puzzles bring you close to a glimpse into the eternal. And to me, I always glimpse it through the math of the thing, where I say, oh, that's a universal principle right there. That thing right there, is that in jigsaw puzzles for you? Do you get a glimpse into the eternal? I have a little bit of an answer myself, which is that knots and knot making provides a glimpse into the eternal, because it's right there. It's the topology of the universe in a knot. But I don't know if jigsaw puzzles have that.
I don't think they all do, but I certainly, when I design, I'm definitely leaning in that direction and really trying to touch that as much as I can and provide an experience that illuminates that to a certain degree. It's very difficult to talk about this. Math points to this. I was listening to your interview with Jan
Golombiewski?
Yes. The comprehensible, the manageable, the meaningful, or cognitive, the physical, and the emotional. So that the cognitive side of things is kind of the math side of pointing to aesthetics. And I think the puzzles that I design try to get to that emotional feeling tone of beauty. What I'm trying to get at is the fittedness of certain patterns to life, and how if you pay close enough attention, you can feel that beauty. So the math, I think, is there. I'm definitely playing with mathematical concepts. But as you said, algebra is not a puzzle that will appeal to the broad masses. It definitely appeals to some. The puzzles that I'm trying to design, I'm trying to appeal to a broader population, I guess, those who would appreciate the math side, the cognitive side of the puzzle. But I think there's a broader, I guess, a deeper emotional root that I'm trying to get to in my design that gets to fittedness and what genuine fittedness feels like.
I get that. And I want to tell you that your puzzle pieces, when they go together, and this is really important, I think it's a general principle of puzzles, which is that each solution needs to be clearly correct. So you don't want vagueness in terms of the correctness of the solution. And your pieces fit in a very conclusive way. Like you really know you've done it right. It's hard, and it's partially because there's so many variety of shapes on the edge of the puzzle pieces to find them. But when you find them, you really know in your heart that that one is right. And that's not true of a lot of puzzles. There's a lot of puzzles where the cardboard ones where you put them together, you're like, is that right? You have to hold them up to the light and see if there's a gap, you know?
And that's where not all puzzles, I think, fit that fully beautiful aspect of what an aspirational puzzle might seek to do. What you described before in terms of how the traditional puzzles are cut along a grid, and because it's a commodity, it's not a piece of art, it's not an artifact, manufacturers will often reuse the same die cut with different pieces of art. Oftentimes, the die cut is very large, goes beyond what the art piece is, and they can shift the die cut, and so that it feels non-repetitive, but actually it's just because the repetitiveness is hidden in a larger pattern that's not obvious to the puzzle solver.
I'll tell you why that's a real miss. Why I find that really not appealing. When you interact with a piece of art, which your puzzles are, it's a communication between the artist and the person interacting with the art. And a traditional puzzle, the shape of the puzzle is mute. It doesn't carry any communication between the maker and the receiver. Whereas every single piece in one of your puzzles, it's all communication. It's all, I feel the hand of the maker. I feel like I'm experiencing the decisions of the decision maker here. And I also feel like those decisions are for me. That you're making a decision, but you know that that decision speaks.
That is something I'm trying to play with, is this establishment that maybe another description or another definition of puzzles is that they're theory of mind, empathy playgrounds. By engaging in that playground, by walking into that playground, you can see that there was intent behind where the slide is placed, where the swing set is. Why is there a teeter-totter here? There's clear design intent, and then it can be experienced. It's not only seen, but then in engaging with the playground, you can see that it was done hopefully with love, hopefully with a beneficial intent in mind. And you can connect to the fact that, hey, someone actually thought about this and decided to implement it. And now I'm on the receiving end of that, and I'm part of that experiment.
I think that's a really important statement, and I think it applies to all of work. And a part of what we talk about on this show is how all of work can be an empathy playground where you feel that work is being designed or created or delivered or evoked with you in mind. It may get you wrong, but at least it's working on thinking about who you are and meeting you there. What is an alternate solution in a jigsaw puzzle?
Alternate solutions are essentially a second solution or maybe additional solutions beyond the primary solution. And so in the puzzles that you received, I think all of them had at least one alternative solution. And so there will be a reference image provided. The fairly typical standard solution would be you've got an image and you have to reassemble all the pieces into that image provided. An alternate solution is to take some of those pieces and create something anew with those.
Okay, I didn't take that step. I saw those images, but I didn't take the step to find the alternate solution. But I will say that to me is a little bit of a glimpse into the eternal. The idea that a puzzle can have two solutions and that those two solutions are mutually exclusive, but that they both work.
Mutually exclusive and compatible.
And yet compatible? That's really interesting. That's a really interesting thing.
I've got a question. In your own framework of puzzles, problems, and messes, how does an alternative solution fit into that rubric?
That's exactly what I was thinking about. Let me describe puzzles, problems, and messes. First of all, it's not my rubric. It's Michael Pidd, who wrote a book called Tools for Thinking, and he was a business analyst. And he created this taxonomy. He said, when you're a business analyst, you run into different kinds of problems. There's puzzles. Puzzles have one correct solution, and they really have one path to solving them. He said, problems have multiple correct solutions, and a part of the problem is that you have to decide what solution you want. And there's multiple ways of solving them, those things. And then messes, he said, are complexes of problems. So they're problems all interlinked with each other. And so my classic example of a problem is, what school should my daughter apply to for college? Well, what do you want out of college? That's the first thing you have to ask is, what problem are you trying to solve with college, right? So those are the kinds of things where they're not the kind of thing that you're going to find in the New York Times puzzle section. Because what you want, the comfortable kind of puzzle, is the kind of puzzle where you go, I am right. Now, what I would say about your puzzles is that the first solution, you get to it and you say, I am right. And you absolutely know the detect of rightness. It's perfect. It's a perfect detect of rightness. I don't think it breaks the pattern at all to say there is another pattern of rightness. That was not an accident. I think a crossword puzzle that had multiple ways of solving it would be a defect. But if it had one way of solving it and then a deliberate second way, that's not a defect. That's cleverness and something else. What do you think?
I would agree with that. So in that sense, I think most jigsaw puzzles actually aren't puzzles within that taxonomy. They're probably more problems and maybe in some cases messes. I think each individual pair, two jigsaw pieces, that is a puzzle because there typically would only be one way to fit those. And in some cases, the bad puzzle designs, they would have multiple because they're using a grid with very similar locks. And in that sense, you don't get that clarity of fittedness.
You don't. What you'd like them to do is you'd like them to snap together. You want that detect that tells you that you've done it right. By the way, I grew up with puzzles. I grew up not with jigsaw puzzles so much, although we did play them. I grew up in a house full of Danish, modern brain teasers.
Right, parlor puzzles.
Yeah. Is that what they're called? Because
That's
this was
what I
exactly,
know them as,
exactly
yeah,
what
so,
they were.
Loops and ropes.
Loops and ropes and odd metal shapes that go together and you try to get them apart. But also tanagrams. And tanagrams are an interesting example of a puzzle because they have one correct solution, that's the square solution, and then they break open into all these other possible, they don't end. Like if that's all they ever did, you'd be done and it would be nothing. But the fact that you can then do these freeform other shapes with them and that there's all these additional challenges, really interesting.
And that to me touches back on the aesthetics of beauty. Tangrams, I think they touch upon maybe that mathematical sense of the infinite. They provide what I'd like to describe as a ramp towards the infinite. You can have a very specific puzzle, a very specific shape that you need to make with the pieces. It has one solution and one solution only. But the fact that you can make other shapes with those same puzzle pieces is pointing to that infinite You can call it the divine, the sacred, whatever term you want to use. But I think there's an aspect of representing the macrocosm of life within the microcosm of the tangram puzzle.
I also noticed that with tangrams, a part of what you're playing with is, and a lot of puzzles, is you're essentially playing on the frontier of people's cognitive capacity. It's like the reverse of user interface design. User interface design is, I'm going to design something that is absolutely intuitive to you. And this is, I'm going to design something for you that is just beyond the intuitive. It's just beyond what you can do.
Yeah, it's an invitation to the leading edge and to go beyond the leading edge, right? It's not just going up to the edge. It's saying you can actually take a step forward and move the leading edge.
I want to start taking this over to work. One of the big things about work is that work usually comes to you as messes when you're trying to solve puzzles. So lots of people say, I hire my job to solve puzzles. And a part of what I've found is that when people say that, you dig a little bit deeper and you find out that they like to solve different kinds of puzzles. One person likes really tidy but difficult math problems. And this other person really wants to wade into messes, really wants the green field. I have to discover what the complex of problems is. But the thing is that the puzzles you make are designed by a person, and when they arrive in my hands, I'm in communication with you. And they are designed to be just beyond my grasp. When I get a puzzle at work, and it may be not a puzzle, it may be a problem, it may be a mess. It's not a jungle gym, it's a mountain. It's not designed for me, it's an accident in the world. And yet, it's still possible to see the beauty in it and the challenge. And I think the rewards are the same. And I think that we can, if we're conscious about it, pull forward the elements that are natural attributes of compelling puzzles. I can give examples of that a little bit. And one of them is that if I'm running a project that's a 2-year project, one of the challenges is that it's possible to feel like nothing's happening for 2 years. But if you create midpoint milestones and you structure the midpoint milestones so that every 2 months we reach some detectable completion of some problem that we're trying to solve, then I can actually design the experience of incremental wins into the project the same way that you would design incremental wins into a jigsaw puzzle.
From my perspective, I think the way I describe that is assessing the scale of the problem. Oftentimes we get, it's the turning molehills into mountains. We can do the opposite. That is a much better way of framing the messes that we deal with in our lives. Whereas if we do the opposite and we turn molehills into mountains, we want to disengage from that immediately. But the way to really engage with life is to break the messes into small pieces. And by then find the fit, solving that 2-piece puzzle and getting that micro win, getting that feedback that, yes, you've discerned correctly that these 2 pieces go together, gives you a taste for what it feels like to ultimately solve the mountain, the mess mountain. Maybe one thing I can add here is that when I'm at these public engagement events, so if I'm at a craft market and I'm selling puzzles, I'll typically have a demo puzzle on display. And it's interesting how people will interact with that puzzle or how they describe solving puzzles. One of the key steps that many people don't do when they're trying to solve a mess of a puzzle is they don't put all the pieces of the puzzle out on the table. They'll take a handful of pieces out, put them on the table, and then they will go through each piece one by one and say, does this piece fit with this one? No. Drop a piece, grab another. Is this the right fit? No. Grab another. But the piece that matches the piece that they have in hand is likely still in the box. So if you've got 500 pieces in the box and you've taken 10 out, the piece that likely fits best, not necessarily, is still in the box. So you have no capacity to either solve the molehill puzzle or the mountain puzzle because you don't have all the elements of play exposed to the puzzle solver.
I watched my sister solving a puzzle this last holiday. What she did do is she took all the puzzle pieces out and she laid them out and she divided them up by color. 2 of the colors she put back into the box. And it was partially because our table wasn't big enough. And interestingly, cognitively, our table is not that big, right? When we're solving a mess, right? We can't get all of it into our brain at once. We have to get the pieces going. So there's a way in which she's simplifying the problem, in part because of the size of the table. I found that very unsatisfying because I wasn't there when she divided it up and I didn't trust
The sort.
the sort, but it worked and it worked really well. But it was creating a sub problem that was not quite as massive.
Right. It's not as rich a problem. It's more approachable.
Right. It's more approachable. And by the way, with your puzzles, I immediately thought, oh, I'm going to take these to my sister. But then I want her to give them back because I need to give them to somebody else. There's a way in which these are puzzles that you want to hand on to different people. One of the things I noticed that you do is you go to puzzle festivals. I don't know what they're called, but they're all puzzle makers come together with other puzzle solvers. And what is the character, the non-random character of the people who arrive at those festivals?
Well, to be clear, I've attended one, exactly one.
Okay, I found the one that you attended.
Yeah. I don't know if this character is pervasive to all, but I think there's an aspect of obsessive compulsiveness to it. Just this need for things to fit a pattern. We're pattern seeking animals. And I do think there's an aspect of OCD that factors into puzzle solvers in that our worlds or lives are often chaotic and they lack that clear signal of sensible pattern. And I guess there's a need for us to impose a little bit more control in our lives. And this gives us a foothold on control, or perhaps an illusion of control. But nonetheless, it gives us agency in a world that perhaps doesn't deliver as much control as we would desire.
Somebody that I'm speaking to later in the week, Vivian Ming, I'm blanking on the word that she uses, but she basically says that one of the predictors of success in any domain is fanaticism. And what she means is the compulsion to solve whatever problem it is. You know, if you're a skater, it's the compulsion to go try another ollie. If you're a software engineer, it's this compulsion to, on the weekend, figure out that thing. And we've talked about compelling puzzles, and now I'm talking about compulsion. They share the same root. It's this idea that there's a drive. And I agree with you that compulsion might be in the need to create order in a world of disorder. It's like this drive to find that thing.
This compulsion, this fanaticism, this deeply rooted curiosity that compels you to act. This reminds me of Justin Gary's core attributes for success. I'm not sure if you've had a chance to read his blog or reach out to him. I think he'd be another great guest. He's a game designer who is adapting design rules for games in a way that you could apply, I think, to life, to business, to other domains. And I think he'd be another great guest.
And what are his core attributes?
He has this mnemonic that he calls core attributes. So the C is for curiosity, which I also agree with. His O is obsessiveness, which I think ties to a specific style of curiosity. The R is resilience. And then the last E is empathy. And by developing each of those core attributes, curiosity, obsession with something that is meaningful for you, that maybe ties into an obsessive pursuit of ikigai and practices that lead to resilience. And then also keeping in mind the empathetic relationship to the world. And I would describe this as a non-selfish, non-egoic view, that you have to step out of your egoic stance and embrace the world in many different ways, often in a relational way.
What's so interesting about that is that if we look at your puzzles, they are designed for the curious, the obsessive. Well, I'm going to say the resilient because most of the times when you try to match a piece, it doesn't work. And so you come back to it. And a part of that is, oh, I have an assumption about how this is going to be solved. Oh, that assumption's wrong. I need to come up with a new theory. Right? That's the kind of resilience. And empathy, what's interesting about that is that it's part of the rewards of the puzzle, is that I am, through the puzzle, experiencing the puzzle maker. And vice versa, is in your making of the puzzle, you are experiencing a hypothetical solver. And so the idea here is then, which really becomes a lot clearer to me, is if I can design a work experience for you that excites those attributes. And resilience, by the way, is the opposite of learned helplessness. And so it's, imagine a community of people working together toward a goal, all of whom are curious, obsessive, resilient, and empathetic. I can't even think of a better example of a product team. That's what a product team is. It's like on the edge, it's trying to discover. That's a very powerful combination of things to be able to excite in another human being. And puzzles do that. And so to the extent that we can perceive work as a puzzle or create work that is a puzzle or enhance the attributes of work that are puzzle-like for people who are compelled in that way, it's a very, very powerful idea.
I agree.
I want to talk about your work for a second, which is you have a warehouse and you have a bunch of people. You are not solely a designer sitting in a room with a CAD program doing this. You have a warehouse with physical manufacturing and clearly the craziest precision jigsaw machine I can even imagine or something like that. What's your job like?
I want to be respectful to my staff and my crew, but it is a bit of a beautiful mess. I've discovered through puzzle design that I'm willing to engage with beautiful messes in order to smooth out the messiness and make things more beautiful. And I think that aspect of learned helplessness is one of the things I'm trying to counteract. A lot of my conversations out in the world are conversations surrounding, well, we've tried that and the mess was not beautiful. And therefore, this mess cannot be beautiful. And I'm constantly bumping up against that boundary condition that is from out there. It's not from within our walls. It comes from out in the world. And yet we still have to deal with it because that's the expectation of work, is that there are just things that just can't be solved. And so you have to bump and grind and you have to compromise in some fashion. That's just the nature of work. And you have to grin and bear it as opposed to, let's actually just sit down, have a conversation, and let's figure this out. Let's put all the pieces on the table. Let's sort things out. And then let's come together and create something beautiful. But there's a lot of signal from the world that suggests that these messes can't be beautiful.
Right. People have tried to solve a lot of puzzles out there in the world, and they were unsolvable. And so they bring the experience of having unsolvable puzzles into the environment.
Yes.
The second thing is a half-solved puzzle where the edges are still open and you can't fit the rest of the pieces. It may even be 90% solved, but it's not 100% solved. And so you just don't get the feeling of like, nailed it.
Right.
So the trick, it seems to me, with what you're describing is that, for one thing, it's not a static puzzle. It's a dynamic puzzle that is adapting and changing. And so you're constantly solving it and it's constantly becoming unsolved.
Absolutely. And there's a bit of we want the clear, concise, not complicated, not complex, definitely not chaotic. There's a context that we like where we apply the single solution, single approach, step 1, step 2, step 3, and we expect that from work. And when it doesn't show up, we just don't like the signal that we're getting. And so there's a misattribution of context and therefore a misattribution of the potential solution that can be derived from the mess.
Right. And one of the things I think it's a real harm to companies is that if you want simplicity, go into accounting. If you want the columns to add up, go into accounting. But because accounting dominates so much of our decision making inside companies, the companies is this giant ball of beautiful mess, but you can't govern it. You can't govern that mess from the accounting department because that simplicity of bookkeeping does not have the requisite complexity to manage this bigger mess, to govern this bigger mess. And yet the bigger mess will absolutely die if you don't solve that that accounting problem.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. Choosing the right approach given the scale of the mess, and also not misattributing what the outcome should feel like given that you haven't applied the right context.
Mm-hmm. Do you find that with each additional person on your team, is it an exponential growth of messiness?
I've been thinking a lot about the Dunbar number effect within teams, within communities. And my sense is the scale of approach should be adapted to the network effects of who's involved. We've got a small team. We're probably going to land at about 10 employees by the end of the year, but we had 7 full-time employees as of January of last year. We added 2 more, and we're about to add 2 more seasonal. From a proportional perspective, it's a scale jump. If we look at a Dunbar number type network diagram, the number of relationships is explosively large. And if we're used to a team of 6 and we approach the complexity from a field of view that only takes in 6, but there's 10 people there, you don't have all the pieces on the table. So it's impossible to sort properly. And if you can't sort properly, then it becomes very difficult to solve the beautiful mess.
So here's what I'm hearing. I asked this question, what job do you hire your job to do for you? I'm going to make a couple of assumptions here and you can disagree with me. A part of what you hire your job to do for you is not to solve puzzles, it's to make things. The experience of having made, so much of what you do is on the surface of invention and making, but the business is more than a puzzle. It's at least a problem and it's probably a mess. So I'm going to ask the question then, and then we'll get back to whether or not that's working for you. What do you hire your job to do for you?
It's a great question. And I think it's only possible to answer looking back at what the job has done for me. Because as I explained at the outset of the conversation, I didn't really know what this would do for me. It came about a bit of an accidental circumstance of my life, in that this wouldn't have happened if I'd pursued, or if the work kept coming from an engineering consultancy background. But I was delivered circumstantially a mess to solve. And so this was a possible solution, and I've explored that solution in this way. Looking back, I would say that I hire StumpCraft as an aspect of creation and exploring the value of creation. I think it's in maybe attacking messes, attacking problems that we become more. I'm a bit of a recovering perfectionist. And so the other thing that I've seen through the lens of the business is that it's curing me of a unhealthy view of what perfection is. I now see the business and art as a idealized path towards perfection that doesn't require perfection. And it allows me to explore that space in a way that I absolutely have to let go of perfection, true perfection. If I look back at some of my past puzzles, I feel a twinge of, I really could have done this better. But that ship has sailed, it's in the past, and I'll just make the next puzzle better. And there's something tantalizing about seeing the journey. I look back on that journey, and maybe people who engage with the puzzles can also engage in that journey and see the evolution, the adaptiveness on display.
Yeah, this is true in writing, which is that your critical self will always exceed your creative self.
Yes.
In other words.
One additional thing that I've hired StumpCraft to do for me is this pursuit of connectedness, relatedness, relationships. It's in an artifact, an embodied form. As an introvert, I tend to be a bit of a recluse, but it's forced me into the world in a way that I guess harvests the value that I have and exposes it to the world and encourages others to do likewise.
Yeah, the surface area of your company in terms of the number of people it touches is much greater than when you were doing an analysis for internal use by some mining company, for instance. And so that had maybe an audience of a dozen. And now you've got this gigantic surface area of people that you touch directly.
And it's absolutely uncontrolled. So there's a lot of letting go. I'll put hours, months of time into a design, and there's no known outcome. I can assume that there will be a positive outcome, but I don't know how broad, how far that reaches, or what ultimately the value will be extracted from any single puzzle engager. There's a lot of trust in just making the thing and putting it out into the world. In that aspect, it's also, I'm hiring StumpCraft to make me a little bit braver in engaging with the world.
Every single thing that you described just now is in the transformation economy. I don't know if you heard the episode with Joe Pine.
I did, yes.
And you talk about puzzles that way, which is that puzzles are a transformation economy product in part. And you've said more than once, we become more by. We become more by solving. And you're in a world that is not very puzzle-like. You're making puzzles, but the world around you is much more mess-like. And a part of your becoming is not how to get the pieces to click into place perfectly. A part of what you are becoming is somebody who can thrive without the pieces clicking into place.
Yes.
Perfectly.
Back to that resiliency.
Yeah. Yeah, right. Exactly. A part of what I hear in this is that a lot of people I talk to, when they express frustration with their work, it's because it's a mess, because it feels like a place that's made of a lot of individually smart people, but collectively really dumb or collectively counterproductive. And they see that as like an overhead on their job, or it's an externality to their job. But a part of what you're doing when you talk about your work is you are saying, no, that is the job. And it is possible to see puzzle-like beauty in the messiness. It's interesting. That must be something that comes and goes for you. There must be times when you're just like, shit, this sucks. And then you stand back and you say, oh yeah, no, I can see how it's beautiful. That must ebb and flow.
Absolutely. The chaos does show up, as it should, right? Because you can't control everything. And so, absolutely, there are moments in time when I want to get out of there too. I want to get out of that mess. But ultimately, I'm part of that mess. I can accept my role in the mess, and I can accept other people's roles in the mess. I can accept that the world itself is a bit messy. And the beauty is in getting immersed in the mess and choosing the messes that fit as well. Oftentimes, it's that lack of agency that we often bump up against that causes the problem. I didn't choose this mess. I might question that, depending on the person who I'm having the conversation with. I think oftentimes the messes that we haven't chosen are actually very much chosen because we don't want to engage with the mess that we bring to the table. Would prefer to transfer it externally. That's not my problem. It's this other person's problem, or it's the world's problem. And the world is a big place. I'm just a little cog in that. I can't possibly move that mountain. Therefore, I have no role to play in it.
I'm in traffic. I am not traffic. Right?
Yes.
That one. And with your company, you can't escape it. You made that mess.
Absolutely.
You didn't get hired into the mess.
Oh, it is entirely my own.
Yes, I made this mess.
Yeah. Or I've swallowed a little bit of the world messiness in an attempt to digest it and transform it. I'm increasingly seeing the company itself as a transformational economy artifact, Not exactly sure what that means or what that translates to in terms of business practices, but I'm seeing parallels in the puzzles I design and the beautiful mess that I've created and how that relates to community, how that relates to my crew, how that impacts my life with my family. It's all part of a large macrocosm that is beautiful.
Yeah. It's interesting to me that the puzzle of your business is dynamic. The puzzles you create are static once they're created.
Aside from the alternate solutions.
Aside from the alternate solutions, right. That's right. But even the alternate solutions are fixed in the puzzle when it ships. It's not going to change itself. There's not going to be new pieces that need to be added.
Not yet.
Oh, yeah. Okay, I see a puzzle. It's one where you send it in 3 pieces. Here's the first piece. You can solve it. You're going to feel really good. Oh, no, here's this other piece. And, that's very attractive. I'm going to subscribe to this puzzle. Evolution is what it is, a puzzle subscription. What did your job cost you?
I've thought long and hard about this. That's a tough nut to crack. I guess I worry about the cost it has on my family primarily. I've got 2 teenagers that are now entering into this transitionary period from teenager to adulthood. And the business takes on a lot of my cognitive capacity and emotional capacity, I would say. And there's only so much to give. And if I'm giving it to the business or I'm giving it to my patrons, I just don't have the capacity to give it necessarily as much at home. We have a good home life, but I do question whether the split is the healthiest way of looking at it. It's one of those unresolvable messes. I'll find out in a decade or 2 or 3 whether the mess that we're in remains beautiful or is even has transcended to a different level of mess. That's maybe what it will cost me. I've got a big heart and I care about the business. I care about my staff. I care about my community. I care about my family. And I'm constantly wondering, worrying whether I'm divvying up my attention in the right way. And I don't think there's any way of knowing that, but that's constantly in the back of my mind. I respond based on intuition, really. And so far, it's served me well, but that is one aspect. I think there's an aspect of, by being compassionate, I'm somewhat vulnerable, and that has taken its toll. There are big chunks of me that are missing as a result, but I wouldn't say that I wouldn't want to go through that again. Are there costs? Yes. It's too early to predict whether they are not also beneficial. Maybe the other thing I can add in here is that coming from a geological perspective, geological background, I see a lot of parallels to geological formation. So the mountains that we see, the beautiful mountains that I go visit on a regular basis when I'm hiking, that is beautiful. And those geological formations only came about through a lot of hardship, a lot of pressure, a lot of repetitive stress. And I get a lot of meaning by going out to the mountains and viewing that beauty. So I hesitate to say that that pressure and that repetition and that stress, it's a cost, but the cost is necessary in order to get the value.
It may be a short-run cost, and it may be a long-term value, and you just can't tell. And in fact, this is something that I've said, which is that what people want from work is they want it to do the job for them that they want it to do at a reasonable cost. But depending upon the scale at which you look at the problem that you're working on, many people are willing to pay a cost up front with the idea that they're going to get something lasting. And we had Rob Copeland come on the show, and he talked about Ray Dalio's company, Bridgewater. And he talked about how toxic the environment was from his perspective and the fact that it tore down people's egos. And then we had Jeff Hunter on the show. Jeff Hunter worked at Bridgewater. And what he said was essentially, yeah, it was horrible and I'm better for it. And so it's hard to say, it's hard to say when is too much.
Just as another example, I didn't actually realize I had a bit of that entrepreneurial spirit until I got into StumpCraft. And it came after having tried to do group facilitation process. Well, I did group facilitation process for co-housing developments and actually had a project that I was trying to develop here in Calgary. And some of that vulnerability, that trust in other people that is absolutely necessary, ended up costing us the project. It didn't go through. We had a general contractor who claimed for 8 months that we were on budget, and then suddenly we were 70% over budget. And when you're doing a grassroots project and you trust your professionals and they end up lying and misleading you for 8 months and then suddenly come out with a death blow, it's very difficult to overcome that. The amazing thing is that the group that was at the core of that endeavor is still largely together, still largely a community. And the glue that kept the community together is the hardship we went through. I would absolutely not want that hardship for anyone. I especially did not want it to happen for those in my community. And yet, through that effort and ultimately the failure of the project, I think we're stronger. I think I'm stronger. But that's a tough, tough pill to swallow, especially if it's up front. Hey, we're going to go through some hardships together, but we're going to make it, right? It's the Odyssey.
Right. All you know at the time is the hardship. You don't know the results.
Yeah.
And in fact, it's one of the challenges, which is that people do hire their job to build community and relationship, but friendships are largely forged through hard times shared, which you don't really want to design into the experience of anyone, is the hard times shared.
That's not exposed. It's a hidden cost. It's almost dishonest to the level of being ignored.
Thank you very much for taking the time from your work in your mess, in your beautiful mess, to come talk to me. It was a great conversation. Where can people learn more about you and about StumpCraft?
For StumpCraft, you can go to stumpcraft.com, so stumpcraft.com. And I'm exposing myself to a little bit more vulnerability. I'm starting to write on Substack, and you can find me there at Releasing the Muse. So that's my handle on Substack.
Fantastic. Thank you. This is great. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you, Dart. Love the conversation. Happy to do more of this anytime.
Thanks for joining me for another episode of Work for Humans. If you enjoyed this episode, please give us a 5-star rating wherever you listen to podcasts. And share the show with one person you think would get value from it. Believe it or not, this really helps us grow the show and reach more people who want to build the kind of work that people really want. As always, thank you to my producer, Jason Ames at Ninth Path Audio, for his insights into content and his high standard for quality. Final note, the opinions shared here are my own and not the views of Google or Cisco Systems. Thanks again for listening. See you next time.